Hi, I'm Johns Hopkins with Baltimore Heritage, and welcome to the second in our 5-part video series as we help the Associated Jewish Federation of Baltimore celebrate its 100th birthday. As with the first video, I'm going to be joined by Beth Goldsmith, who's chair of the Associated's Board of Directors. But before I turn it over to Beth, I thought I'd say a few words about where we are and then get us going a little bit. We're here in front of the Jewish Museum of Maryland on Lloyd Street in East Baltimore, right at the corner of Lombard Street, Old Corned Beef Row. If you've ever been to Atman's Deli, that's where we are. The Jewish Museum tells wonderful stories about the Jewish experience in Baltimore and in Maryland, including the experience of immigrants, and that's what we're going to talk about today. To put things in perspective, between 1880 and World War I, over 1 million Jewish people immigrated into the United States. Here in Baltimore, we were lucky. 25,000 of them settled here. And we can think of the immigration, waves of immigration in terms of these waves or clusters. Of course, people were coming in all the time, but if we kind of think about it in groups, it maybe hopefully helps a little bit. The first group was those arriving before the Civil War. So really from the earliest days of Baltimore, we've had Jewish folks as part of our city. In fact, before we ratified the U.S. Constitution, we had need for a Jewish cemetery. Folks like Solomon Reuben Edding were part of that early group. In fact, Solomon, when we incorporated as a city in 1797, Solomon was one of the first folks elected as a Baltimore City Council member. So we have Jewish families and Jewish people represented in our earliest elected officials. We also, of course, had Jewish congregations forming from a very early date. By 1830, we had the Baltimore Hebrew congregation. That's the first that we can formally trace. But by 1838, we had the Fells Point congregation. 1842 was Har Sinai. And in 1845 was the Lloyd Street Synagogue, which is just down the street here and still standing today as the third oldest Jewish synagogue that survives. Most of the folks in this early period were from Germany, either directly from Germany or like the Eddings with a stop in Pennsylvania before coming over. The second wave of immigrants was the big wave, 1880 to World War I. And it was not just Jewish folks coming in, it was folks of all stripes. We had Catholics and Protestants from Ireland and from the rest of Europe coming in. And the Jewish immigrants were largely not from Germany this time, but from Eastern European countries. Many of those countries were experiencing agricultural droughts and depressions. Starvation was a very real thing. Their totalitarian governments were also cracking down, telling people what jobs they could have, where they were allowed to live, forced military conscription. So the folks coming in this wave of immigrants were really fleeing dire circumstances. And this is when the Associated and its affiliate groups started to organize specifically to help immigrants. They had been organizing to help poor folks and women and children, but now specifically for immigrants. In 1903, we got the Hebrew Immigration Aid Society. It was formed in New York by Russian immigrants, but we got our chapter in 1903. It helped people get through customs, helped them try to find family members, and helped them find temporary housing. In 1909, the Jewish Education Alliance set up classes to help new arrivals learn English and American customs. They called them Americanization classes, and that really helped a number of people who were coming in that era. During World War I, immigration all but stopped, and it slowed to a trickle during the 20s and the Great Depression. But the next big wave, of course, came from Germany and surrounding European countries as the Nazis were taking over there. But I'm going to turn it over to Beth to talk about that. All right, Beth, we're all yours.
Thank you, Johns. As Johns said, in the years leading up to World War II, Jews began fleeing Germany. Fearful of escalating persecution, many scrambled to find a way to get themselves and their families out of Germany and Europe. The Associated and its agencies worked tirelessly to get as many people into the United States as possible. At the forefront of this effort was the Hebrew Immigration Aid Society, or HIAS, which was an agency of the Associated. The staff was working around the clock to do whatever it could to help as many Jews as possible flee Europe on the cusp of World War II. As one HIAS professional told it, as he explained what a day was like in 1936, here we're interrupted by a phone call with a Baltimorean wanting to know How can I send old clothes to Poland? We told them the information in Yiddish and English, letting them know it would be mailed immediately. Another phone call came from a social worker whose client wished to make an application for citizenship, but didn't know the name of the steamer which came to Baltimore in June 1912. Another phone call? This time it came from a sister of a German refugee, anxious to have affidavits of support sent to him. An appointment is made for her to call the next day. And the calls kept coming, and coming, and coming. In New York, aid societies helped roughly 95,000 people settle into their new home. In Baltimore, we helped 3,000 people settle here, including children who were taken in by local families. The trauma of being a refugee was compounded by the stress and anxiety that all immigrants feel as they leave their country and arrive in a new land where they don't speak the language, don't know the customs, may or may not have work, and may or may not have family or friends. On top of this stress, America in the 1930s and early 1940s was full of anti-immigrant feelings. In private conversations and in the public press, many people blamed immigrants, and particularly Jews, for things like the economic collapse and the Great Depression, the lack of jobs, and even social unrest. So when Jewish refugees landed in America, whether it was in New York or Philadelphia or Baltimore, they often faced a cold and even hostile environment. We at the Associated back then were very much part of the effort to get them acclimated to their new environment. We formed a new group called the Refugee Adjustment Committee to aid in the effort. This group, under the Associated's umbrella, helped people find jobs and housing, assisted with food when needed, and helped children get started in their education in America. Unlike some of the earlier campaigns of the Associated, much of this work was done as quietly as possible. The Refugee Adjustment Committee very much wanted to help more and more people escape Germany and succeed in Baltimore, but did not want to draw any more attention to its work than necessary. At the same time, HIAS was providing social service assistance, and it helped German refugees process restitution claims against the Nazis for their persecution. Although other cities had sister Hebrew immigration aid societies, ours in Baltimore was the only one to provide this service. And after the war, HIAS helped people who were displaced come to Baltimore. I'll wrap up by saying that the work of the Associated started back then to help Jews fleeing Germany carries on today. Whether it was Jews escaping communism from Central European nations or those escaping persecution in Egypt and Iran, the Associated provided everything from interest-free loans, financial assistance, job training, and English classes to help them successfully integrate into their new home.
All right, thanks so much, Beth. I'm going to wrap up with two more waves of immigrants, Jewish immigrants into Baltimore. The first was following World War II, when countries around the world, a number of them, became communist. And a number of those communist governments cracked down particularly on folks of the Jewish faith. In Hungary in 1956, for example, the revolution really suppressed people of Jewish faith. In Cuba in the 1950s and 60s, the same thing was happening. And in Egypt a little bit later, after the Yom Kippur War, folks of Jewish faith were really cracked down on. All of that, of course, driving people to flee their countries. The Associated came up with a number of solutions as back 50, 60 years before to help new arrivals. The Associated's Jewish Family and Children's Bureau helped find housing for families and helped place kids in school. The last wave I'm going to talk about is from the Soviet Union in the 1970s through the 1990s. And this is an interesting wave because it, in addition to getting new arrivals, it also sparked an enormous backlash in Baltimore and in around the country protesting Soviet policies. We think of Mikhail Gorbachev as perestroika in opening up the Soviet Union, but his government was squarely a part of the Soviet Union's forced assimilation assimilation policy, where they were essentially suppressing religious faith, especially Jewish faith, and maybe trying to make the communist government the spiritual center as well as the physical center of all things in Russia. Of course, folks were fleeing because of that. Here in the United States, in addition to helping folks, the Associated helped protest those policies. On January 18th, 1971, for example, 1,500 people marched from the Washington Monument here in Baltimore up to Hopkins University. Along the way, they had a clever chant: 1, 2, 3, 4, help break down the iron door. 5, 6, 7, 8, let our people emigrate. 1,500 people protesting there. And then on December 6, 1987, a group of 10,000 Jewish folks and allies protested on the National Mall in Washington. The Baltimore Jewish Council and the Associated helped lead Baltimore's contribution to that protest. Overall, here are some numbers of Soviet immigrants. 165,000 people during this period fled to Israel. 125,000 came to the United States, and we were lucky to get 10,000 of those here in Baltimore. Interestingly, the Associated response had to change a little bit. Of course, it did what it always has done and provide housing and help find family members where they could. But this time it also had to help provide Jewish education. A number of these families, the Soviet Union had prohibited them from learning the practices of being Jewish. And so a number of programs came up. Comprehensive Housing Assistance, CHI, came into being to help with the housing side of things. But the Baltimore Board of Jewish Education came up with a clever idea. They raised money to provide scholarships to young kids to send them to Jewish primary schools to get an education, including a Jewish education. All right, I'm going to stop there and say thanks for joining us. And Beth and I hope you'll join us for the next 3 videos as we talk about things like the role of women in Jewish charities, as well as equity and justice issues throughout the ages. Thanks so much, and we'll see you next time.